Every single morning, millions of modern Britons tap their transit cards at a bustling London Paddington or Manchester Piccadilly turnstile and step onto a train, entirely unaware that their comfortable daily commute was originally bought with blood in the pitch black of a half-dug Victorian tunnel. Deep underground in the 1830s, lit only by the flickering orange glow of a single tallow candle, men are fighting a brutal war against solid Pennine stone. They are gasping for air in the suffocating heat of the shafts, their muscles screaming as they tear at the unyielding London clay with crude iron tools. These men are not uniformed soldiers on a foreign battlefield, but they are fighters all the same, locked in a desperate, deadly struggle against the very bones of the earth. Known as navvies, this rough army of Irish and English labourers carved out the nation. Every inch forward is a victory won through shattered fingernails, blown eardrums and bruised ribs as the crushing 1,000-ton weight of the tunnel ceiling constantly threatens to collapse and bury them alive in the damp, suffocating dark. The sprawling modern railway map that we trust so easily today was entirely carved out by these forgotten armies of men swinging blindly in the dirt. Over the course of just a few decades, nearly 250,000 navvies moved hundreds of millions of tons of earth, relying on nothing but gunpowder, wheelbarrows, and sheer physical endurance to reshape the British landscape forever. To truly understand the violent birth of the passenger train, you have to mentally feel the heavy 20-pound iron head of a pickaxe hitting solid granite or dense limestone. The violent shock of that impact travels straight up the arms, jarring the teeth and rattling the spine, repeating endlessly over a grueling 12-hour shift. These men faced rock formations that had sat undisturbed for millions of years, breaking them apart by sheer force of will. They worked waist-deep in blinding silica dust that permanently coated their lungs and stung their eyes, hauling away the heavy debris rock by rock in simple wooden barrows. At monumental sites like the 2-mile-long box tunnel or the Deep Tring cutting, it was a slow, agonizing crawl through the landscape. They were breaking the ground step by step, foot by foot, driven entirely by the sheer, unyielding force of human muscle and black powder. This agonizing physical toll, paid in broken bodies and shortened lifespans, was the only possible way to lay down the flat, endless iron roads that would completely change the world. Because early locomotives could not climb steep hills, the navvies had to create perfectly level pathways across a violently uneven country, filling in deep valleys and carving straight through massive mountains. Yet, beneath the thick grime, the black powder burns and the broken bones, this monumental engineering effort was ultimately driven by a profoundly simple human desire, the desperate need to not be alone. Imagine being born in a tiny, cold Yorkshire village or a remote Welsh valley, surrounded by high hills and impassable bogs, knowing with absolute certainty that you will likely die exactly where you stand. For the vast majority of human history, the physical world was an inescapable prison made of distance, where a rural farm worker could easily live their entire 80-year life without ever seeing the ocean just 30 miles away. The people trapped in these isolated, self-contained towns hungered to reach out, to see distant loved ones, to trade their local goods at larger markets, and to simply know what existed beyond their own small, immediate horizon. Breaking through that solid limestone rock meant finally breaking the invisible, ancient walls of geography that had kept humanity separated from itself since the dawn of time. The railway was not merely a technological invention. It was a radical social liberation that promised to stitch a fractured, disconnected island into a single, unified nation. Before the iron rails were laid down, the everyday reality of travel was a painful, exhausting, and incredibly expensive nightmare. The standard toll roads of the 1820s were often little more than deep, freezing trenches of thick, impassable mud that could literally swallow pack horses whole and snap wooden stagecoach wheels like brittle twigs during the harsh winter months. A standard journey from London to a northern city like Edinburgh was not a casual afternoon trip, but a terrifying, multi-day expedition that required weeks of bone-rattling misery in the freezing rain. Highwaymen and bandits hid in the dense woods along the Great North Road. The bitter cold seeped into the drafty wooden carriages, and the sheer physical punishment of moving across the country crushed people's spirits and emptied their wallets. The old world was effectively a trap of slow, agonizing movement that kept rural communities desperately poor, culturally isolated, and permanently stuck in the mud. Fresh food rotted long before it could reach the city markets, and heavy raw materials like coal were practically impossible to transport over land for more than a few miles. Into this dark, disconnected world stepped a man named George Stephenson, an underdog fighter born in 1781 into the absolute poverty of the northern coal mines in Wylam, Northumberland. He was not a wealthy, university-educated gentleman of science, but an illiterate labourer who grew up in the dirt, wiping black soot from his face and listening closely to the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the early industrial steam pumps that kept the mine shafts dry. Where wealthy mine owners just saw loud, clunky stationary machines designed only for pumping water out of deep holes, Stephenson looked at the raw power of the steam engine and saw a mechanical way to set people free. He dared to dream of putting that roaring coal fire on wheels, creating a high-pressure iron horse that would never tire, never sink in the winter mud, and never stop pushing forward across the horizon. His seemingly impossible vision was to harness the raw, explosive violence of boiling steam to permanently conquer the vast, unforgiving distances of the British landscape. Stephenson wanted to build a machine that could drag heavy carriages of coal and eventually living passengers, connecting major industrial hubs like Liverpool and Manchester at speeds the human mind had never before experienced. But the established world does not surrender its old, profitable ways without a brutal fight, and Stephenson faced heartbreaking opposition from the wealthy people in power. The rich, aristocratic landowners, the powerful canal monopolies, and the highly educated engineering experts of the day laughed right in his face during hostile parliamentary hearings, treating the uneducated, thick-accented northern miner like a dangerous, delusional fool. They stood in grand committee halls and publicly mocked his dream, testifying that his train was a deadly, fire-breathing monster that would poison the pristine country air, terrify the livestock, burn down local crops with flying sparks, and tear the country apart. The emotional toll of being told his entire life's work was a dangerous joke was a heavy burden, but the arrogant laughter of the elite only hardened his resolve to prove them all wrong. Every cruel joke, every rejected proposal, and every closed door merely fueled the burning fire in this underdog's engine, pushing him closer to the ultimate fight of his life. Stephenson knew that to silence the critics, he would have to build a machine so undeniably powerful and efficient that it would drag the entire British Empire, kicking and screaming, into a blindingly fast new era. The Industrial Revolution was never just a story of cold, unfeeling machines. It was a sprawling, hungry beast born of desperate human needs in the 1820s. Across Britain, dark industrial centres like Manchester swelled with tired families crammed into soot-stained streets, all shivering through bitter winters while crying out for cheap coal to stay warm. Giant iron looms and towering factory chimneys cast massive, heavy shadows over these exhausted neighbourhoods. The nation was trapped in a suffocating bottleneck, producing mountains of cotton goods and tearing millions of tons of black coal from the earth, but lacking any fast, reliable way to drag that vital weight across the muddy, rutted roads and slow, monopolised canals of the country. To feed this hungry mechanical beast and keep the exploding urban populations from freezing, a completely new artery of iron had to be violently carved into the landscape. Wealthy merchants in Liverpool realised that only a dedicated twin-track steam railway could break the transport monopoly and save their booming industries from absolute paralysis. But the earth refused to surrender quietly, presenting its most terrifying defence in the form of Chat Moss. This was a massive, ancient, bottomless peat swamp spanning 12 square miles in the north of England, a treacherous sponge up to 30 feet deep that swallowed absolutely everything thrown into its muddy jaws. Where wealthy parliamentary experts demanded surrender and declared the route impossible, Chief Engineer George Stephenson refused to back down from the fight. He ordered his men to weave thousands of wooden hurdles, bundled heather and empty tar barrels, creating a vast floating raft of timber and earth that somehow held the heavy iron rails above the hungry, sinking mud. Conquering that impossible black bog proved that human willpower could literally build a solid path over a liquid wasteland. For months, exhausted workers dumped thousands of tons of soil and stone into the hungry swamp until it finally stabilized, creating an engineering marvel that still miraculously supports the heavy weight of modern express trains today. Yet, building the 31 miles of track was only half the battle, because convincing ordinary people to step onto a screaming, smoking iron beast required conquering a deep, primal fear. When the first passenger carriages finally opened their doors on September 15, 1830, men and women stood on the platforms with shaking hands, pounding hearts, and ringing ears. Prominent medical doctors had publicly warned that travelling at the unnatural speed of 30 miles an hour would cause passengers to suffocate, claiming the human body would simply tear apart under the extreme pressure. Stepping aboard meant ignoring these dire scientific predictions and trusting a terrifying, fire-breathing machine with your very life. Those brave enough to grip the hard wooden benches of the open-air carriages and brace for impact were about to cross a historical threshold from which humanity could never return. The thick smell of burning coke and sulphur filled the air as the engine crew shoveled fuel into the glowing firebox, preparing to unleash unprecedented mechanical power. As the pressurized steam hissed and the massive drive wheels finally bit into the iron rails, the shaking terror instantly dissolved into a deep, thrilling rush. A sharp, cold wind whipped across their faces as the heavy carriages surged forward, turning the slow, familiar agricultural landscape into a sudden, dizzying blur of green trees, grazing sheep, and stone walls. Passengers gasped in sheer wonder, clutching their heavy woolen hats and staring wide-eyed through the open windows of the rushing train. In that breathtaking rush of smoke and rhythmic mechanical noise, a sudden, tearful realization washed over the crowd. The vast, intimidating world they had known their entire lives had just permanently and dramatically shrunk. That explosive burst of locomotive speed completely shattered the ancient boundaries of distance and time forever. A brutal journey that once took days of bone-rattling carriage rides through dangerous weather was suddenly reduced to a mere 2 hours of comfortable, scheduled transit, fundamentally altering how humanity perceived the very geography of the Earth. But this magical illusion of effortless flight was paid for by a hidden army of outcasts swinging heavy steel picks in the freezing mud. These were the navigators, or navvies, a rough, wandering workforce of raw, bruised muscle numbering in the hundreds of thousands who ripped through the stubborn British countryside entirely by hand. They lived entirely outside polite Victorian society, eating cold scraps of beef, sleeping in damp, crowded shanty towns along the tracks, and bleeding right next to the dirt they shoveled. Their worn leather boots and blistered hands laid every single heavy timber sleeper and hauled millions of cubic yards of earth to make the glorious new era of speed possible. Without the backbreaking anonymous labor of these wandering men, the grand, world-changing visions of wealthy engineers like George Stephenson would have remained nothing but ink on paper. The elegant viaducts and perfectly graded embankments were carved not by steam machines but by the sheer, relentless brute force of Irish and British peasants desperate for a daily wage. The work was not just physically exhausting, it was violently unforgiving, exacting a brutal daily toll in human lives. To blast through solid granite in places like the notorious Woodhead Tunnel, these men packed unstable black gunpowder into deep, hand-drilled holes, relying on nothing but crude, unpredictable fuses and desperate prayers in the dark. A tiny, unpredictable spark or a delayed fuse could trigger a massive, deafening boom without a single second of warning, and in an instant, brothers and friends were just gone in the choking rock dust. It is a heartbreaking reality that every single mile of this bright, new, connected world was bought with the blood and shattered bones of the men who built it. The lingering smoke from those fatal underground blasts served as a grim, permanent reminder that industrial progress always demands a terrible, quiet sacrifice. Today, the bodies of countless unnamed navvies remain buried in unmarked graves alongside the very tracks they laid, serving as the silent, forgotten foundation of the modern transportation age. Out in the freezing damp of the Pennines and the crushing summer heat, a fierce and silent loyalty formed among the outcasts who built the lines. Known as navvies, these men formed a rough, nomadic army of nearly 250,000 forgotten souls, fighting a daily, brutal war against the stubborn British earth. They lived shoulder to shoulder in muddy, makeshift shanty towns pitched alongside the tracks, sharing massive daily rations of beef and heavy beer to fuel their exhausted, broken bodies. When a heavy stone crushed a leg during a careless gunpowder blast or a sudden dirt collapse buried a friend in a deep cutting, it was these brothers in the mud who desperately dug them out with bare hands and carried them home. That shared blood and sweat forged an unbreakable human foundation for the thousands of miles of iron roads stretching across the Victorian landscape. Without their immense physical sacrifice and raw muscle power, moving upwards of 300 million cubic yards of earth by the mid-1840s, the grand designs of celebrated engineers would have remained nothing more than ink on paper. Ahead of them lay impossible geological barriers, forcing these tired men to slice straight through the heart of solid mountains like the massive Pennine chain to create the notorious Woodhead Tunnel. There were no giant roaring electric machines to chew through the dense gritstone and granite, leaving them entirely reliant on calloused hands gripping heavy iron picks, simple shovels, and highly unstable black powder. They chipped away at the dark, weeping rock face inch by agonizing inch, using simple wooden timber props to hold up thousands of tons of crushing earth suspended directly above their heads. It was a staggering, highly dangerous feat of human endurance, hollowing out 3-mile-long subterranean passages while standing waist-deep in freezing groundwater, armed with nothing but raw muscle, weak tallow candlelight, and absolute determination. Every dark, terrifying tunnel they carved into the British bedrock became a permanent, echoing monument to their quiet suffering and incredible physical strength. The casualty rates rivaled major military campaigns of the era, yet their relentless labor successfully laid down a continuous steel spine that would permanently reshape the geography and economy of the entire nation. As those hard-won tracks finally reached out across remote river valleys, they touched small, sleeping agricultural towns and coastal communities that had remained deeply isolated for centuries. Imagine the pure electric shock rippling through a quiet, cobblestone village square when the loud, triumphant shriek of a steam locomotive whistle and the heavy vibration of iron wheels pierced the country air for the very first time. It was the mechanical sound of a rapidly industrializing wider world crashing into their quiet lives, bringing a sudden rush of joy, wonder, and terrifying speed to rural people who had never traveled more than 10 miles from their own front doors. Where horse-drawn carriages once lumbered at a miserable walking pace, steam engines now promised to hurl passengers across the countryside at an astonishing 40 miles per hour. Bringing the once distant horizon right to the edge of the local station platform. That piercing steam whistle signaled the absolute end of the old, slow agrarian world, dragging the stubborn countryside violently into a highly connected modern future. Almost overnight, remote provincial markets were suddenly flooded with fresh coastal fish, daily London newspapers, and mass-produced factory goods, permanently breaking the ancient cycle of deep rural isolation. But just a few miles away, a painful and completely opposite economic reality was unfolding for the unfortunate places the new iron tracks completely missed. Once thriving market towns and busy roadside coaching inns that had catered to stagecoach travelers for generations suddenly found themselves stranded in the quiet dirt, entirely bypassed and economically starved by the rushing tide of mechanical progress. Cobblestone streets that used to echo with the constant clatter of horses and wealthy stagecoach travelers grew eerily silent, causing local blacksmiths, stable hands, and tavern owners to watch their businesses slowly wither and die. There was a deep, lingering heartbreak in standing on a quiet rural hill, watching the black coal smoke of the fast trains speed past in the valley below, knowing your centuries-old hometown had been permanently left behind to fade into historical memory. The rapidly expanding new network of steel served as a cruel, uncompromising economic judge, instantly deciding which communities would explode into wealthy industrial boomtowns like Swindon and Crewe, and which historic settlements would inevitably turn into forgotten ghost towns. The mere placement of a single surveyor peg could dictate the financial destiny of an entire region for the next 100 years. This unstoppable cross-country speed soon collided with a bizarre and deeply ingrained habit of daily British life. Before the train timetables arrived, every single town simply made up its own local time by looking up at the sun and setting the parish church clock, meaning solar noon in London was actually 10 full minutes ahead of solar noon in the western city of Bristol. But a fast-moving express train could not safely operate on a confusing patchwork of 100 different local times without causing catastrophic head-on crashes and total scheduling chaos. In November 1840, the Great Western Railway literally forced the entire country to stop looking at the sky and agree to share one single synchronized clock based on Greenwich Mean Time, forever changing how humanity experienced and measured the passing of a day. Railway time rapidly transformed into standard national time, binding millions of disconnected strangers together under the exact same ticking minute. Public clocks across the countryside temporarily featured two minute hands to show both local and railway time, until the sheer dominance of the train schedules finally erased local time zones entirely, synchronizing a modern nation from coast to coast. With the country finally running on the precise rhythm of the same standardized clock, the fast trains unlocked a beautiful, almost magical new power for the poorest citizens. Following the introduction of the uniform penny post in 1840, a tired working-class mother could suddenly afford to buy a cheap stamp and send a handwritten letter to a son looking for factory work hundreds of miles away in the industrial city. That tiny scrap of paper, carrying profound love, quiet tears, and desperate financial hopes, could now fly across the country overnight, sorted by clerks inside specially designed traveling post office carriages while moving at 50 miles per hour. It was a massive emotional revolution, finally allowing vulnerable families torn apart by crushing poverty and vast geographical distance to hold on to each other through the power of the written word. The heavy, smoke-stained mail cars rushing through the dark, sleeping countryside became a vital, roaring lifeline of human connection. By carrying millions of cheap letters alongside their wealthy passengers, the railways transformed from simple industrial haulers of coal and iron into the very arteries of a newly unified, highly communicative modern society. For the first time in human history, a tired laborer did not have to sleep in the shadow of the very mill that drained his strength. The rhythmic clattering of iron wheels offered a sudden mechanical escape hatch from the dirty, choking smoke of the industrial city. Men and women whose entire lives had been confined to a few crowded, soot-stained streets could now step onto a wooden platform and be carried miles away from the grueling noise of the factory floor. This daily migration birthed the earliest suburbs, creating a profound social transformation for the everyday worker. Rows of modest brick houses began to rise on the quiet, green edges of major cities, connected to the urban center by a ribbon of steel. A father could spend 10 hours sweating in the deafening roar of a textile mill, then board a steam-powered carriage and return to a home where the air was actually clean enough to breathe. Leaving the toxic smog behind was just the beginning of a much wider awakening, as railway companies soon realized that massive profits lay not just in moving daily commuters, but in moving millions of ordinary people looking for leisure. The life-changing introduction of cheap train tickets unlocked a world previously reserved only for the wealthy. Hard-working families who had never once stepped outside their home counties suddenly found themselves packing tightly into open-air train cars on a rare day off. The sheer thrill of moving faster than a galloping horse was matched only by the unbelievable destination waiting at the end of the line. Imagine the overwhelming sensory shock for a child raised in a dark, landlocked slum, stepping off a train and laying eyes on the vast, crashing ocean for the very first time. Coastal towns exploded with new life, filled with the dirty, soot-covered faces of factory workers tasting salt air and feeling sand beneath their boots. It was a brief, beautiful taste of freedom, purchased for just a few pennies. That brief taste of seaside freedom fundamentally altered the British weekend, turning isolated fishing villages into bustling holiday resorts that required engineers to push the tracks into increasingly dangerous landscapes. Bridging those deep, wild valleys required brave men to fight a terrifying battle high in the sky. Workers balanced on narrow wooden planks hundreds of feet above crashing rivers, wrestling with thousands of tons of heavy iron and red-hot rivets. The wind up there howled violently, threatening to tear them from their precarious perches with every sudden gust. The dizzying, stomach-dropping heights brought a constant, paralyzing fear of falling, yet these men kept working through sheer, crazy courage. They swung heavy hammers with numb fingers, trusting their lives to thin ropes and the steady hands of the brothers working beside them. Every massive iron pillar that rose from the valley floor was paid for in sweat, nerve, and all too often, blood. The incredible bravery shown above those crashing rivers echoed long after the final rivets were struck, most notably when George Stephenson completed the towering high-level bridge in Newcastle in 1849, but conquering the sky only solved half the problem. The growing network now demanded heavier trains running at terrifying speeds through the darkest hours of the night. Look intimately at the men driving these screaming, fire-breathing machines through the pitch-black night. Up on the footplate there was no protection from the elements, just a fierce, blinding wind and the freezing, biting rain lashing against their faces. They stood inches from a roaring furnace, their eyes straining violently against the darkness to spot a single, faint signal lamp in the gloom. The physical toll of wrestling heavy iron levers was eclipsed only by the crushing mental weight of their duty. These solitary drivers held the fragile lives of hundreds of sleeping people directly in their soot-stained hands. A single moment of lost focus, a misjudged curve, or a failure to see a warning flag through the thick fog could mean immediate, catastrophic disaster. The heavy burden carried by those solitary drivers eventually forced the invention of automated track signals and telegraph communications to prevent horrific collisions. Yet even as the safety of the network improved, the physical presence of the tracks themselves was violently altering the natural world. This epic fight for speed and connection left permanent, undeniable scars on the actual face of the land. Quiet green hills that had stood undisturbed for millennia were violently ripped open, replaced by deep, dark tunnels that swallowed trains whole. The earth was carved, blasted, and reshaped to obey the strict, unyielding geometry of the iron road. Massive stone bridges and towering brick viaducts cast long, dark shadows over ancient farming valleys, permanently dividing fields and altering the flow of rivers. The natural curves of the British landscape were suddenly cut through by straight, harsh lines of crushed rock and steel. The old, quiet world was paved over by the unstoppable march of progress. Those straight, harsh lines carved into the earth created a permanent physical grid that dictated where towns would thrive and where they would wither. But while the landscape was fractured, the people living within it were suddenly, miraculously drawn closer together. This journey brings us to the most profound realization of the railway age. Distance no longer meant goodbye forever. Before the trains, a son moving just 50 miles away for work was essentially lost to his mother, their separation feeling as final as death. The journey by horse or foot was simply too long, too dangerous, and too expensive for a poor family to ever attempt. The iron tracks shattered that heartbreaking reality, shrinking the vast country into a manageable, connected neighborhood. That same son was now just a short, cheap train ride away, able to return home for a Sunday dinner and be back at the factory by Monday morning. The crushing isolation of rural life was broken, replaced by the beautiful comfort of knowing your loved ones were finally within reach. defeating the tragedy of permanent separation, fundamentally rewired the emotional fabric of the entire nation, proving that the true power of the railway was not in the iron or the steam, but in the human bonds it preserved. Yet beneath the triumph of connected families and shrinking maps lies a heavy, silent truth. Every single piece of iron track laid across the British landscape holds a ghost. We ride smoothly today in cushioned seats, gliding effortlessly over what are, in reality, the unmarked graves of the labourers who forged the routes. These were the men who poured their sweat, their blood, and often their lives into the cold dirt to build this modern world, leaving behind no monuments but the rails themselves. The durable consequence of their staggering sacrifice was a nation fundamentally rewired by law and commerce. The Railway Regulation Act of 1844 forced companies to provide cheap, basic travel for everyone, a legal mandate that permanently broke the monopoly of the rich over long-distance movement. This single piece of legislation transformed the railway from an exclusive private luxury into an absolute public necessity. It ensured that the steel arteries pumping life through Britain belonged, at least in daily practice, to the very working-class people who had broken their backs to carve them out of the earth. The human aftermath of this sprawling network left entire communities permanently altered, dictating where towns thrived and where they withered into dust. Places like Swindon and Crewe, once quiet rural outposts, exploded into massive industrial hubs purely because the railway companies decided to place their engineering works there. Conversely, ancient coaching towns that the railway bypassed simply faded into obscurity, their bustling inns falling silent as the main roads emptied. The Iron Road acted as a ruthless sorting mechanism, deciding the economic fate of millions with the arbitrary stroke of a surveyor's pen. The wider aftershock of this engineering marvel reached far beyond domestic travel, changing the very mechanics of how Britain governed its empire. By 1852, the blueprint of the British Railway was exported to India, beginning a massive, continent-spanning construction project that would redefine global logistics. Engineers used the exact same methods perfected on the damp hills of Yorkshire to blast through the solid rock of the Western Ghats, standardizing the movement of troops and trade goods alike. The local solution for moving coal had mutated into a tool of imperial control, proving that whoever controlled the rails controlled the flow of history. Still, a haunting, unresolved question lingers in the public memory of this great industrial leap. We can count the miles of track laid and the millions of tickets sold, but the archives cannot fully measure what was lost when the quiet, isolated soul of rural Britain was shattered by the shriek of the steam whistle. We will never truly know if the fierce, localized identities of small villages were worth trading for the convenience of a unified, fast-paced nation. The historical record shows us the immense wealth gained, but it remains forever silent on the psychological cost of a world forced to move faster than the natural rhythm of human life. Ultimately, the most profound cultural result of the railway era was the permanent standardization of time and experience. The necessity of a single timetable forced every clock in every town square to bow to Greenwich Mean Time, erasing the local quirks of the sun. This synchronization forged a shared national reality, where a merchant in London and a weaver in Manchester were finally living in the exact same minute. The chaotic, disconnected island had been welded into a single synchronized machine, operating under one relentless schedule. Today, the physical scars of that monumental effort have softened into the familiar backdrop of the British countryside. Moss covers the brickwork of towering Victorian viaducts, and wild grass reclaims the forgotten branch lines that once pulsed with steam, soot, and the raw ambition of an empire. Next time you stand on a cold, rain-slicked platform waiting for the morning train, look down at the heavy steel rails cutting through the mist. They are not just metal and wood, but the enduring pulse of a staggering human saga holding the weight of a transformed world.